The people with the smallest homes sometimes make room for the biggest miracles. Rain poured across the quiet Chicago street in heavy silver sheets, turning cracked sidewalks into shallow mirrors that reflected the orange glow of aging streetlights. Most people hurried home with their heads lowered, eager to escape the cold spring storm that had settled over the neighborhood before sunset. No one noticed the tall man standing beside a worn leather suitcase outside a modest apartment building. Those who did notice quickly looked away. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, yet it was soaked from the relentless rain. His polished dress shoes were covered with muddy water. His posture remained straight, almost dignified, but exhaustion rested quietly behind his pale eyes. Daniel Park had spent years surrounded by people who competed for the privilege of standing beside him. Tonight, not a single person waited with an umbrella. The building manager closed the front door behind him with an apologetic glance before locking it for the evening. Rules were rules, she had explained. Temporary housing had expired, and there was nothing more she could do. Daniel had simply nodded without arguing. Pride had never protected anyone from loneliness. He rested one hand on the suitcase handle and watched passing cars disappear into the rain. For the first time in years, there was nowhere he was expected to be. Several blocks away, Naomi Carter pulled the hood of her faded jacket tighter as she finished another 12-hour shift cleaning luxury apartments she could never imagine living in herself. Her small paycheck rested safely inside her purse beside a grocery receipt, a library card, and a folded photograph of her late grandmother. She walked the same route home every evening, usually stopping at a neighborhood bakery just before closing because unsold bread was discounted after 8 o'clock. Tonight the shelves had already been emptied by other families trying to stretch another week's budget. She smiled politely anyway, wished the cashier a good night, and stepped back into the rain carrying only a carton of milk and a small bag of rice. Her apartment was barely 400 square feet, but she had always believed that gratitude made even the smallest place feel larger. As she turned onto her street, something unusual caught her attention. The well-dressed stranger standing alone beneath the flickering streetlight did not look impatient or angry. He looked like someone trying very hard not to inconvenience anyone else. Rainwater dripped from his dark hair as he quietly adjusted the handle of his old suitcase. He glanced toward the apartment entrance once before looking back at the sidewalk, almost as though he hoped no one would notice he had nowhere to go. Naomi slowed her steps. Common sense reminded her that inviting strangers into her home was never a decision to make lightly. Yet another memory surfaced just as quickly. Her grandmother used to say that kindness begins where assumptions end. Naomi studied the stranger for another moment. His expensive clothes did not match the loneliness in his eyes. His silence did not feel threatening. It felt heavy. She opened her umbrella, walked across the rain-soaked sidewalk until they stood beneath the same circle of light, and gently held the umbrella over both of them. Daniel looked up, clearly surprised that anyone had stopped. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain continued falling around the edges of the umbrella while passing headlights swept across the empty street. Finally, Naomi offered a small, reassuring smile and said the simple words that neither of them would ever forget. "You can stay with me, if you do not have anywhere else to go." Daniel stared at her, convinced he had misunderstood. No one had ever offered him shelter without first asking what he could give in return. For the first time in many years, the answer he could not find was not hidden in power, influence, or wealth. It was hidden in the unexpected kindness of a stranger standing in the rain. Daniel remained silent for several seconds, not because he doubted Naomi's sincerity, but because he had forgotten what uncomplicated kindness sounded like. Throughout his life, every invitation had carried expectations, every favor had demanded repayment, and every smile had concealed careful calculation. Yet the young woman standing beneath the umbrella looked at him with nothing except quiet concern. She did not ask his last name. She did not ask why a man wearing an expensive suit had nowhere to sleep. She simply waited, allowing him the dignity of making his own decision. Finally, Daniel gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said softly. The words felt strangely unfamiliar on his tongue. Naomi smiled as though accepting a guest was the most ordinary thing in the world. She picked up one side of the old suitcase without asking permission. Daniel instinctively reached for it, insisting he could carry it himself, but Naomi laughed gently. "Then we will both carry it," she replied. Together they climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor while rain tapped steadily against the old windows lining the hallway. The apartment door opened to a room no larger than 400 square feet. A small sofa sat beside a bookshelf filled with worn novels borrowed from the public library. A folding dining table rested near the kitchen, where a single lamp cast warm light across clean countertops. The furniture was old but carefully maintained. Fresh flowers in a recycled glass jar brightened the windowsill. Everything inside reflected patience rather than wealth. Naomi quietly handed Daniel a clean towel. "The bathroom is through that door. There are dry clothes that belong to my grandfather. They may fit well enough for tonight." Daniel hesitated before accepting them. No one had offered him something so personal in years. When he returned a few minutes later, wearing a simple gray sweatshirt and comfortable cotton pants, he looked almost like a different man. The sharp lines of expensive tailoring had disappeared, replaced by an unexpected sense of peace. Naomi was already preparing a modest dinner. Steam rose from a pot of vegetable soup while rice cooked beside it. She apologized with an embarrassed smile. "I was planning something more exciting, but this is what I have tonight." Daniel looked at the small table set for two and quietly answered, "It looks perfect." She poured soup into mismatched bowls that had obviously been collected over many years instead of purchased as a matching set. Before eating, Naomi bowed her head for a brief moment of gratitude. Daniel respectfully followed her example. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt restful. During dinner, Naomi spoke easily about ordinary things. She described the elderly woman whose apartment she cleaned every Tuesday, the neighborhood children who always waved when she walked home from work, and the bakery owner who sometimes added an extra loaf of bread to her bag without charging her. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He found himself fascinated by stories that most people would have considered unremarkable. They carried a kind of richness he had not experienced in a very long time. After the meal, he quietly reached into the inside pocket of his discarded suit jacket and removed a thick leather wallet. He placed several $100 bills on the table. Naomi looked at the money, then gently pushed it back toward him. "Not tonight," she said with a warm smile. "Guests do not pay on the first night." Daniel stared at her in complete disbelief. It was not the refusal that surprised him most. It was how naturally she had said it, as though generosity required no explanation. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows, but inside the little apartment, something neither of them expected had already begun to grow. Morning arrived quietly as pale sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, replacing the sound of rain with the distant rhythm of city traffic beginning another workday. Daniel woke earlier than Naomi, a habit formed over many years of carrying responsibilities that never seemed to sleep. For a few moments, he simply sat on the edge of the neatly folded sofa bed, taking in the peaceful silence surrounding him. The apartment was still modest, still no larger than 400 square feet, yet it felt strangely spacious because there was no tension hiding inside its walls. Every object had its place. Every corner reflected care instead of luxury. A knitted blanket rested over the arm of the sofa. A tiny potted plant reached toward the morning light beside the kitchen window. Framed photographs filled one narrow shelf, showing smiling faces gathered around birthday cakes, church picnics, and neighborhood celebrations. Daniel realized something that surprised him. There was not a single expensive object anywhere in the room, yet nothing felt incomplete. Before Naomi woke, he quietly noticed the kitchen faucet dripping into the sink one drop at a time. The cabinet beneath it had been carefully lined with an old towel to catch the moisture. He searched beneath the sink, found a small toolbox, and after several patient minutes adjusted the worn valve until the dripping stopped completely. Then he tightened a loose cabinet hinge, repaired the handle on the screen door that had nearly fallen off its screws, and carefully straightened a dining chair that had wobbled the previous evening. None of the repairs required special tools. They required only attention. When Naomi entered the kitchen, still tying her apron before leaving for work, she froze in surprise. She turned on the faucet, watched the water flow smoothly, then opened the cabinet door twice before smiling in disbelief. "You fixed it," she said softly. Daniel shrugged, almost shyly. It seemed easier to repair than ignore. Naomi laughed, a genuine laugh that filled the little apartment with unexpected warmth. She prepared scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee while Daniel set the small folding table without being asked. Their breakfast cost only a few dollars, but the conversation felt richer than meals Daniel had shared beneath crystal chandeliers. Naomi spoke about the elderly veterans whose apartments she cleaned every Wednesday, explaining that many of them mostly wanted someone willing to listen for a few extra minutes. Daniel listened carefully. He had spent years surrounded by important conversations, yet somehow stories about lonely neighbors carried greater weight. Before leaving for work, Naomi handed Daniel a spare key attached to a faded blue keychain shaped like a tiny house. "Make yourself comfortable," she said. "There are books if you get bored, and the grocery store is 2 blocks away if you need anything." Daniel looked at the key resting in his palm. "You trust people very easily," he observed. Naomi smiled while putting on her jacket. "No," she answered gently. "I choose to trust until someone gives me a reason not to." After she left, Daniel stood alone in the quiet apartment holding the small key. It was worth almost nothing in dollars, yet it represented something money had never been able to purchase. Hours later, while sweeping the front steps before Naomi returned home, he noticed a black luxury sedan slowly drive past the building without stopping. The tinted window lowered just enough for someone inside to study the apartment before disappearing around the corner. Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. For the first time since arriving, the peaceful little home no longer felt completely hidden. Naomi returned home just after 6 o'clock carrying a reusable grocery bag filled with vegetables, a loaf of discounted bread, and a small carton of milk. The long workday showed in the slow rhythm of her steps, yet the moment she reached the 3rd floor, she stopped in quiet surprise. The hallway outside her apartment looked brighter than usual. The burned-out light bulb that had left the entrance dim for weeks had been replaced. The loose railing that always creaked whenever someone climbed the stairs had been carefully tightened. Even Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the elderly landlord who rarely smiled after dealing with constant repair requests, stood in the hallway shaking her head in amazement. "I do not know who your guest is," she said with a gentle laugh, "but he fixed 3 things before I even had time to ask." Naomi smiled softly, without saying a word. When she opened the apartment door, the comforting smell of homemade vegetable stew greeted her before Daniel appeared from the tiny kitchen wearing the same simple sweatshirt she had loaned him the night before. He looked almost embarrassed to be standing beside the stove. "I hope you do not mind," he said quietly. "I found the recipe inside your notebook." Naomi placed the groceries on the counter and lifted the lid from the pot. Steam filled the room along with the familiar scent of rosemary and garlic. She tasted 1 spoonful and looked back at him with genuine surprise. "This is wonderful." Daniel gave a modest shrug. "My mother believed everyone should know how to cook for the people who showed them kindness." They shared dinner at the little folding table while the evening sun painted warm golden light across the apartment walls. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself discussing ordinary things instead of complicated responsibilities. Naomi spoke about her grandmother's favorite recipes, neighborhood church picnics, and the small community garden where local families grew tomatoes together every summer. Daniel listened carefully, occasionally asking quiet questions that revealed sincere curiosity rather than polite conversation. He realized he had spent much of his life learning how to understand business strategies, while forgetting how ordinary people built meaningful lives, one small act at a time. After dinner, Naomi noticed the repaired bookshelf standing firmly against the wall. The loose kitchen cabinet now closed perfectly. Even the old living room fan that had refused to rotate properly for months now moved cool air gently through the apartment. "You have been busy," she said with a grateful smile. Daniel looked around the little home before answering. "It already gave me more than I deserved. I wanted to leave something better than I found it." Before Naomi could respond, a slow knock echoed through the apartment door. It was neither hurried nor aggressive. Daniel's expression changed almost instantly, becoming calm, focused, and unreadable. Naomi opened the door to find a tall man in a dark business suit standing respectfully in the hallway. Behind him, two black luxury sedans waited quietly along the curb below. The visitor lowered his head slightly before speaking. "Good evening. I am looking for Mr. Daniel Park." Naomi glanced back toward her unexpected guest. Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest moment, as though he had known this moment would eventually arrive. Then, he walked toward the doorway with measured steps. The visitor looked relieved the instant their eyes met. "Sir," he said softly, "we have finally found you." Naomi looked from one man to the other, realizing that the quiet stranger she had welcomed into her tiny apartment was carrying a story far larger than anything she had imagined, yet the only question that came to her mind was the simplest one of all. "Would your friend like to come inside for dinner before you talk?" The man standing in the hallway looked momentarily confused by Naomi's invitation. He had expected urgency, secrecy, perhaps even a difficult conversation. Instead, he found himself being offered homemade vegetable stew by a woman he had never met. Daniel noticed the uncertainty on his longtime associate's face and allowed the faintest smile to appear. "Come in, Michael," he said quietly. "Dinner can wait for business, but business should never interrupt kindness." Michael Kong stepped into the apartment with respectful hesitation. His tailored navy suit and polished shoes contrasted sharply with the modest surroundings, yet his attention was drawn not to the worn furniture or the tiny kitchen but to the unmistakable sense of peace filling the room. Naomi quickly found another mismatched bowl, warmed more stew on the stove, and placed fresh slices of bread on the small folding table, without asking a single question about who Michael was or why luxury sedans had appeared outside her building. She simply treated him like another unexpected guest. During dinner, Michael struggled to hide his amazement. He had worked beside Daniel for more than a decade and had attended formal banquets in private dining rooms around the world. None of those expensive meals had ever looked as meaningful as this simple supper served inside a 400-square-foot apartment. Finally, after the meal ended, Michael placed a sealed leather folder on the table. He looked toward Daniel before speaking carefully. "Everything has changed, sir. The misunderstanding has been resolved. Your properties have been returned, your financial accounts have been fully restored, and every business partner has been asking when you plan to come back." Naomi quietly lowered her eyes, pretending to organize the dishes even though she could not help overhearing the conversation. She suddenly understood that the quiet man who had repaired her faucet and folded blankets each morning had once carried responsibilities far beyond anything she had imagined. Daniel remained silent for several moments. He did not immediately open the folder. Instead, he looked around the little apartment. His eyes rested on the repaired bookshelf, the tiny kitchen table, the fresh flowers beside the window, and the extra blanket Naomi had placed over the sofa before going to bed the night before. Michael followed his gaze, unable to understand why Daniel appeared more interested in ordinary household details than the documents that represented the return of extraordinary wealth. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Do you know what surprised me most these past 2 days?" Michael waited quietly. "No one here asked what I owned," Daniel answered. "They only asked whether I had eaten." The room fell completely still. Naomi slowly turned toward him with an embarrassed smile. That seemed like the more important question. Daniel looked at her with unmistakable gratitude. It was. Michael had witnessed negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet somehow those two simple sentences carried greater weight than any contract he had ever delivered. Before leaving, Michael respectfully handed Daniel the apartment keys to a luxury penthouse that had already been prepared for his return. Daniel accepted them politely, then placed them beside Naomi's small blue house key on the kitchen table. For a long moment, he looked at both keys without touching either one. One opened a home larger than most people could imagine. The other opened a place barely large enough for 2 people to share dinner together. Yet only one of them had ever made him feel truly welcome. As Michael quietly departed into the evening, Daniel remained standing beside the little folding table, realizing that recovering everything he had lost had become strangely less important than protecting the unexpected life he had found inside the smallest apartment he had ever entered. The next morning arrived with clear blue skies that seemed almost impossible after the stormy night that had brought two strangers together. Naomi prepared coffee before leaving for work, expecting Daniel to pack his suitcase and return to the life that had been waiting for him. Instead, she found him standing beside the kitchen window, quietly watering the little potted plant that rested on the sill. The luxury penthouse key Michael had delivered remained exactly where Daniel had placed it the previous evening. Beside it lay the small blue key Naomi had trusted him with only a day earlier. Neither key had moved. Naomi smiled gently as she poured 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you would be gone before I woke up," she admitted. Daniel looked at the sunlight spilling across the tiny apartment before answering. "I realized I've spent many years living in impressive places without ever feeling at home. I wanted one more morning where breakfast mattered more than business." Naomi laughed softly and handed him a warm mug. They shared toast with homemade strawberry jam while discussing ordinary plans for the day. Naomi mentioned that the community center where she volunteered on Saturday mornings was struggling to keep its roof from leaking after the heavy rain. Daniel listened carefully, but said very little. Later that afternoon, after Naomi left for another cleaning shift, Daniel asked Michael to drive him somewhere instead of returning to corporate headquarters. Michael expected another office meeting. Instead, Daniel directed him to the neighborhood surrounding Naomi's apartment. They visited the aging community center, quietly speaking with volunteers, maintenance workers, and local families. Daniel asked thoughtful questions about repair costs, after-school programs, and housing challenges facing working families. He took notes himself instead of asking an assistant to do it. By sunset, he had made a decision that surprised even Michael. Rather than announcing a public donation, Daniel established a private community housing and neighborhood improvement foundation that would renovate aging apartment buildings, repair community spaces, and create affordable homes for hardworking families without placing his name on every wall. "If kindness changed my life without asking for recognition," Daniel explained, "then generosity should be able to do the same." Weeks passed and construction crews quietly began restoring buildings throughout the neighborhood. The leaking roof above the community center was repaired. Broken stair railings inside nearby apartments were replaced. Elderly residents found safe walkways, brighter lighting, and dependable maintenance for the first time in years. Naomi noticed the improvements, but never imagined who stood behind them. She simply thanked the workers each morning before heading to work. One Saturday, she arrived at the community center carrying homemade cookies for the volunteers and frozen surprise. Daniel was there wearing blue jeans, work gloves, and a simple gray shirt instead of an expensive tailored suit. He was helping assemble new bookshelves for the children's reading room while laughing quietly with retired carpenters and neighborhood teenagers. Naomi walked over, smiling with genuine delight. "I thought important people spent Saturdays in boardrooms," she teased. Daniel looked up with the same calm expression she had first seen beneath the rain-soaked streetlight. "The most important meeting I have attended all year is right here," he replied. Naomi handed him a cookie, and they stood together watching neighborhood children race across the freshly repaired playground. Daniel realized that everything he had worked so hard to recover had given him influence, but the simple invitation Naomi had offered beneath a shared umbrella had given him something infinitely more valuable. For the first time in many years, the future no longer looked like something he needed to conquer. It looked like something he wanted to share. Autumn gradually settled across the neighborhood, painting the tree-lined streets with shades of amber and gold that transformed even the oldest buildings into something quietly beautiful. The improvements Daniel had started continued without publicity. There were no large signs displaying his name, no interviews, and no ceremonies. New windows appeared in aging apartment buildings. Broken sidewalks were repaired. A vacant lot that had collected trash for years slowly became a small community garden where families planted vegetables together on Saturday mornings. Naomi admired every change, but never connected them to the man who still preferred sharing coffee in her tiny kitchen over attending extravagant social events. To her, Daniel remained the thoughtful guest who always washed his own dishes, repaired anything that needed fixing, and listened far more than he spoke. One afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks knocked on Naomi's apartment door carrying a stack of unopened letters. Her eyes were unusually bright. "You need to come downstairs," she said. Curious, Naomi followed her into the courtyard where dozens of neighbors had gathered beneath colorful fall decorations. Children laughed while volunteers arranged folding tables covered with homemade desserts. Local musicians tuned old guitars near the entrance. It looked like an ordinary neighborhood celebration until Charles Henderson, director of the newly established Community Housing Foundation, stepped onto a small wooden platform with a microphone. Daniel stood quietly several feet behind him, dressed in a simple navy jacket instead of an expensive business suit. Charles thanked the residents for welcoming the foundation into their community before explaining that none of the improvements would have been possible without one person whose compassion had inspired everything that followed. Naomi assumed he was referring to one of the volunteers until Charles smiled and gently called her name. Confused, she slowly walked forward as neighbors applauded with genuine warmth. Daniel met her halfway across the courtyard. "I do not understand," Naomi whispered. Daniel looked around at the restored buildings, the happy children, and the elderly residents enjoying safe walkways for the first time in years. "You probably never will," he answered with a quiet smile, "because you believed helping someone was ordinary." Charles explained that the foundation wanted Naomi to become community outreach director, ensuring every future project remained guided by the same compassion she had shown a stranger on a rainy night. The position included a meaningful salary, full benefits, and the opportunity to work directly with families needing affordable housing. Naomi immediately shook her head. "There are people with more experience than I have." Daniel gently replied, "Experience teaches procedures. Character teaches purpose. We already know which one cannot be purchased." The crowd fell into thoughtful silence. Mrs. Evelyn quietly wiped away tears. Several volunteers smiled at one another, recognizing that the woman who always carried groceries for elderly neighbors had never changed, even after learning who Daniel truly was. Naomi looked around the courtyard before speaking softly. "If I accept, I want every family to be treated with the same respect you showed me." Daniel nodded without hesitation. That was always the plan. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through golden leaves, children ran laughing between newly planted flower beds while neighbors gathered around homemade food prepared by dozens of caring hands. Standing in the middle of that ordinary celebration, Daniel realized that the greatest decision of his life had not been rebuilding successful businesses. It had been accepting the invitation of a woman who owned almost nothing except a generous heart. And Naomi finally understood that the smallest act of kindness she had ever offered had quietly grown into a home large enough to welcome an entire community. The weeks that followed brought changes no one in the neighborhood could have imagined, yet Naomi refused to let success alter the quiet routines that had shaped her life for so many years. Every morning, she still stopped at the corner bakery before work, greeting the owner by name and buying an extra loaf of bread whenever she knew an elderly neighbor might need it. Every Friday afternoon, she still visited Mrs. Evelyn Brooks to help organize rent assistance forms for residents who struggled with paperwork. The only difference was that instead of carrying one notebook filled with handwritten reminders, she now carried several folders containing plans for affordable housing projects, neighborhood improvements, and family support programs that continued reaching more communities across the city. Daniel watched those ordinary moments with quiet admiration. He had worked beside brilliant executives capable of building remarkable companies. Yet he had rarely met someone who inspired trust simply by showing up every day with consistency and kindness. One afternoon, he invited Naomi to visit the headquarters of the foundation. The modern building overlooked the Chicago skyline through wide glass windows, but the first thing Naomi noticed was not the architecture. It was the welcome desk where every visitor, regardless of appearance or background, received the same warm greeting. The walls displayed photographs of restored apartment buildings, smiling families receiving new keys, children reading inside renovated community centers, and volunteers planting flowers together. Daniel walked beside her without drawing attention to himself. Employees greeted him respectfully, yet he greeted every custodian, receptionist, and maintenance worker with exactly the same courtesy. Naomi quietly smiled. She finally understood why so many people remained loyal to him. His leadership was not measured by authority. It was measured by the respect he showed when no one expected him to. They entered a meeting room where architects, social workers, neighborhood leaders, and financial planners gathered around one table. Daniel introduced Naomi not as the woman who had once helped him, but as the person whose compassion had inspired the foundation's entire mission. The room rose in spontaneous applause, leaving Naomi visibly embarrassed. She gently shook her head and said, "Please do not thank me. Thank every person who chooses kindness when no one is watching." Her words settled over the room with remarkable quiet. Several people lowered their eyes thoughtfully, recognizing the truth behind such a simple sentence. After the meeting, Daniel and Naomi stood together on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city. Evening sunlight reflected across countless windows while traffic flowed peacefully below. Daniel looked toward the neighborhoods stretching into the distance before speaking softly. "I spent years believing success meant building taller buildings and larger companies. Then one rainy evening, someone with almost nothing reminded me that the strongest foundation is built inside people." Naomi looked at him with the same gentle smile she had offered beneath the umbrella on the night they met. "Homes protect us from the weather," she replied. "Kindness protects us from becoming strangers to one another." Daniel nodded slowly, knowing those words would remain with him far longer than any business lesson he had ever learned. As the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, lights gradually illuminated the neighborhoods where hundreds of families were preparing dinner inside safer homes, walking through brighter hallways, and dreaming about futures that finally seemed possible. Neither Daniel nor Naomi claimed credit for those quiet transformations. They simply stood together in grateful silence, understanding that the greatest changes rarely begin with extraordinary power. They begin with one ordinary person choosing to open a door that everyone else had already walked past. Nearly a year passed before Naomi realized how completely one rainy evening had reshaped her life. The little apartment on the third floor remained her home, although the leaking pipes had long since been replaced, and the old hallway lights now welcomed every resident with a warm glow each evening. She never moved into a larger house, even after accepting her new position. Whenever people asked why, she simply smiled and said that some places become too meaningful to leave behind. Every room reminded her that true abundance had first arrived disguised as an unexpected guest carrying a worn leather suitcase. Daniel continued leading his businesses with the same quiet discipline that had once made him successful, but those closest to him noticed something had changed. Board meetings now began with discussions about community partnerships before financial reports. New housing developments always included affordable units for working families. Every major project reserved funding for neighborhood libraries, community centers, and maintenance programs because Daniel believed buildings should strengthen the people living inside them, not merely impress those passing by. Michael often smiled when watching these meetings unfold. He remembered the man who once measured every decision by numbers alone. Now he measured success by the number of lives quietly made better. One crisp autumn afternoon, the community gathered to celebrate the opening of another restored apartment building. Children chased one another across a newly planted courtyard while elderly residents sat comfortably beneath shaded benches, surrounded by colorful flowers. There were no grand speeches planned. Naomi insisted that neighborhood musicians perform instead of hiring professional entertainers because she wanted the celebration to belong to the people who lived there. As families explored their new homes, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks gently approached Naomi with a small wrapped package. Inside rested the faded blue keychain shaped like a tiny house, carefully polished and mounted inside a simple wooden frame. Beneath it, someone had engraved a single sentence. The first door opened every door that followed. Naomi's eyes filled with quiet emotion. She looked toward Daniel, who stood nearby speaking with construction workers rather than local officials. He had never asked for recognition, and he looked genuinely surprised when the crowd slowly gathered around him. Naomi walked over carrying the framed keychain and held it where he could see it. "You should have this," she whispered. Daniel shook his head with a gentle smile.
"No.
That key never belonged to me. It belongs to the person who taught me what home really means." They stood together for a long moment while children laughed in the distance and autumn leaves drifted gently across the courtyard. There was no need for dramatic promises or extraordinary declarations. Their friendship had already become something stronger than either of them had expected, built one ordinary act of kindness at a time. As the afternoon faded into evening, porch lights gradually illuminated windows throughout the neighborhood, each one representing a family beginning another peaceful night beneath a safe roof. Daniel quietly looked across the community before turning back to Naomi. "You once asked nothing from a stranger," he said softly. "Because of that, thousands of people now have a place to begin again." Naomi smiled with the same warmth she had carried beneath a shared umbrella on the night they first met. Sometimes all a person needs is for one door to stay open long enough to remember they still belong somewhere. The cool autumn breeze carried the sound of laughter through the quiet streets as neighbors returned home together, and without fanfare, without headlines, and without anyone seeking applause, two ordinary acts of compassion continued echoing through countless lives, proving that the greatest fortunes are not measured by what we keep, but by what we choose to share. And that day the neighborhood remembered what a true home looks like.